Now we are ready to discuss ARIES. ARIES is an algorithm developed at IBM Almaden by Mohan. It has several variations for different types of transactions. It is essentially an algorithm that combines undo and redo logging that we discussed earlier. Before we discuss the detail of that algorithm, however, we need to first discuss the concept of a checkpoint. Recall that when we discussed undo and redo log-based recovery, we always needed to scan the entire log from the beginning. The idea of a checkpoint is to improve upon that by not needing to read the entire log during recovery. Here's how we will do it. During a checkpoint, we stop accepting new transactions. We wait until all current transactions complete. Here, complete means either committing or aborting. After that, we write the log and all dirty data pages to the disk. Then, we write a checkpoint log record to the disk. At that point, all changes made by previously committed transactions are now written to the disk, and all aborted transactions also have their changes undone. We have finished taking the checkpoint at that time. And then we are now ready to resume processing of new incoming transactions. So why bother taking checkpoints? The advantage of checkpointing is that we no longer need to read the entire log during recovery. In fact, all transactions that were completed before the checkpoint can be ignored, as the changes have already been persisted to the disk. For example, given this log file, during recovery, we don't actually need to consider any of the transactions prior to the checkpoint record. The only transactions that we need to recover are those that started after the checkpoint, in this case T2 to T5. Everything else that happened before can be ignored. In fact, we can even truncate the log file before the checkpoint, as we no longer need it for recovery purposes. The problem with the checkpointing mechanism which is introduced is that the database system cannot process any new transactions while the checkpoint is being taken. Ideally, we want the database to keep processing transactions while the checkpoint is taking place. This is the idea of fuzzy checkpointing. The idea here is, instead of waiting for all transactions to finish, we somehow save the state of our transactions and the statuses of each page in memory during a fuzzy checkpoint. Because the system is still processing transactions as we take the checkpoint, we might have transactions that are still running with their dirty pages not flushed to the disk yet. Hence, we need new data structures to store the information about transactions and page statuses. In fuzzy checkpointing, we need to keep track of two things. First, the state of all transactions. Second, we also need to keep track of the dirty pages and the first write to each dirty page. We will save both 1 and 2 to the disk when we take a fuzzy checkpoint. Then, during recovery, we will first recreate those two sets of information from the disk. Then we will replay the actions recorded from the rest of the log after the checkpoint. And we'll see what that means in a few slides. Now let's discuss the details of the data structures involved in fuzzy checkpointing. As we have discussed before, each log record has a log sequence number, or LSN for short. It is a unique, monotonically increasing number. For instance, the line number of that entry in the log, or the time of the day, so on and so forth. Each data page in the buffer pool also has a page log sequence number, which is used to store the most recent LSN that updated that particular page. We will also keep a 30-page table in memory. That table lists all the 30 pages in the buffer pool. Each page stores the LSN of the first write to that page after it has been brought into memory. Finally, we have the transactions table that records ongoing transactions and their statuses. And besides its status, we also store the LSN corresponding to the last write performed by that particular transaction. We use write-ahead logging in fuzzy checkpointing. This is the same type of log that we have seen before. Unlike undo and redo logs, however, we store both the old and new values of the data element that is being modified in the payload, as we have discussed earlier. Each log record also has a field called previous log sequence number, or prev LSN, that links to the previous log record from that same transaction. The idea here is to use the previous LSN field to quickly jump backwards in the log to the previous action performed by the same transaction. This will come in handy when we need to undo or redo the actions of a particular transaction without reading all the log entries generated by other transactions. So, here is an example of taking a fuzzy checkpoint. Here we have two ongoing transactions, T100 and T200. The 30-page table stores the page ID and the update that first wrote to that particular page. The transactions table stores the current status of the two transactions, with each page in the buffer pool having the page LSN that stores the last write to that particular page. And we have the write-ahead log on the upper right shown here in the slide. To take a checkpoint, we first write a begin checkpoint record to the log and flush the log to the disk. Meanwhile, we continue to process transactions as usual. Then we write the 30-page table and the transaction table to the disk and write the end checkpoint record to the log. And we flush the log record to the disk to finish checkpointing.